Oh, hello, and welcome to Dark Passages. Dark Passages is a weekly podcast presented by me, Chris Stone, reading stories I've written over the past 15 years or so. Today, we are going to continue Route 66 with episode 6.
Hell of a way to go, eh?
Deputy Jim Watkins chewed on a soggy toothpick as he liked to do when the wheels upstairs were turning. It was an old habit that he was too old to break now. With his hands on his hips just above his gun holster, he stood over a dead man. His partner, Lieutenant Carl Hammy Hamilton, stood in the doorway of room 100 at the Blue Oasis Inn. It was how they did things. Only one in the crime scene at a time, easier to eliminate cross-contamination that way. Back in the day, it was all hands on deck, but nowadays you had to be careful about all that shit. The CSI boys from Albuquerque were on their way, and they would have a real shit fit if Watkins or Hammy tracked boot prints through the blood. Jimmy dropped down to a knee beside the dead man on the orange shag. He cocked his head toward the dead woman slumped opposite him, her brains splattered on the wall behind her. He closed one eye and finger-gunned her from his position, checking the alignment with the dead man. He rose to his feet slowly, groaning like old men do as his knee popped and threatened to quit on him.
Fucking bastard.
He mumbled, throwing his hand on top of his knee as he rose for more leverage. Half in and half out of the doorway, Hammy's eyes were wide and white in the darkness. It was suddenly easy to remember how young he was. Had he ever seen a woman with a moonroof in her head and skull and brain fragments dripping down a wall before? He doubted it. Hammy's eyes darted around the room and back to the parking lot. He was focusing on everything at once. His nerves had been turned all the way up like a radio station that was cranked too loud. Hoping to calm the situation, and just because he had to think out loud, Watkins said,
So, Hammy, you walk in and you see the bottle of Jack, the broken lamp, the stripped cord, the clear ligature marks on her neck, and you think, clear, clean, open and shut domestic violence case, you know?
Watkins chomped on his toothpick and made his way over to the dead woman. Her head was slumped and concave, wet, mangled hair hid her features. It wasn't new to scenes like this. He'd seen many suicides on the El Paso beat, but usually it was a pills thing where they'd get the call and there would be a bloated corpse with vomit on her sweater, or sometimes a woman laying in a bathtub full of blood and razor blades. Macabre, no doubt, but clearly and thankfully lacking the gore of a true gunshot between the eyes. The wall behind her looked like someone had thrown several bottles of strawberry jam at it. Thick, gooey jam. He continued.
You would think all of this, and you would be wrong. There is a third person at play here. Have we talked to Junior yet? I'd be curious to know who was on either side of these room walls.
He motioned with his soggy toothpick.
Why do you think there was a third party?
Hammy was calming down. His eyes were less darty. Watkins had gotten him to focus on something other than the woman's exploded head. He was returning from the shock that had threatened to envelop him. It was working.
Well, you see, if a man wants to off his lady, it's usually not a gun between the eyes. There are other ways. If he hates her enough to kill her, a gun can be too fast, too unfulfilling.
Watkins chomped his toothpick flat.
You see, they'll beat them to death, or even strangle them, which brings us to the marks on her neck. I say he used the lamp's extension cord to strangle her.
Jim walked over toward Carl, plucking the toothpick out of his mouth and gesturing it toward him.
But as you see, she didn't die of strangulation. Something or someone stopped him. I say someone knocked on the door and interrupted him. I say this third party had a gun. I say this third party shot them both, either on purpose or by accident.
Jim paced back toward the crime scene.
And you may think, nah, fuck it. He tried to strangle her. Bitch wouldn't die, so he shot her. And that does happen. More often than I care to admit to, given my last assumption. But, and it is a mighty big but, he has a bullet in his belly. How could that be? What kind of motherfucker puts one between his girl's eyes and then thinks, you know what? I think I'll bury some lead in my gut. Exactly no one. That's who.
He jabbed his toothpick in the corpse's general direction.
If he had taken one in the temple, I'd be leaning murder, suicide, but he didn't. And what's more, there's no weapon. The gun has up and vanished. So I say we are undoubtedly looking for another person. Someone else dealt all this death. Not him. Okay, I've seen enough. Let's tape it off, let the boys from Albuquerque do their science magic, and let's go talk to Junior. Maybe some good old-fashioned detective work will turn something up.
Hammy pulled a small notepad out of his shirt pocket and flipped it open as he followed Watkins to the hotel office.
Where are we?
Moon asked in that sweet, groggy, sleepy voice that only a 20-something-year-old girl can muster. If I had to guess, I'd say we're a few clicks from Albuquerque. The morning sun peeked over the horizon behind them, casting an eerie light to their backs as they continued driving into the darkness. The morning in the desert reminded Moon of an eclipse. Everything's so dark, and yet still that hint of light to come. You know it's daytime, and yet everything is still mostly dark. You know the whole world is awake, but you. Moon shifted her butt, peeling her legs off of the leather seat.
I gotta pee.
Rain kept driving, his hands resting on top of the vibrating wheel, his eyes focused on the semi-dark horizon before them. After a few silent moments, he spoke. You know, I was thinking out here in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night, must be pretty easy to drop someone off and no one would ever find them. Moon's eyes grew wide.
What are you talking about?
She asked in the calmest voice she could muster. Rain's eyes focused on the horizon, unwavering, and as she twisted her hands nervously in her lap, he said, That asshole and that poor woman, we should have brought them along for the ride. We could have dumped them out here and no one would ever be the wiser. Moon relaxed a little, the fish she'd curled loosened.
Didn't have time, Rain. You know Junior was calling the cops. We would have had one body loaded in the back of this thing, and then we'd be surrounded by flashing lights and in silver bracelets faster than a prairie fire with a tailwind.
Rain's lips curled into a frown. Yeah, I know, but maybe we should have. I mean, just last night we were driving and I saw a burnout RV on the side of the road covered in dust. That thing had to have been there for a while, and yet no one bothers to move it. Do you know why? Moon was silent, her hand still twisted in a loose knot. Because no one fucking cares. There could be skeletons in that trailer for all the fuck anyone knows, but no one stops to look. Everyone figures it's someone else's problem, that someone else will take care of it. We could have dumped those bodies in that fucking trailer and it would be years before Johnny Law happened along and actually opened it. Hell, by then we could be in fucking Quebec learning French or something. Do you see what I mean?
I don't feel like learning French.
Her voice had taken on a monotone that he wasn't used to. Rain started tapping his finger on the steering wheel, his eyebrows clenched together, chewing his lower lip. Shit had just happened too fast. It was daylight now. Things were so much less macabre in the daytime. Yeah, sure, the man was still dead, the woman's brains were still splattered on the desert scene wallpaper, but when the sun rose, it seemed just like any other day. When Watkins and Hammy had finished their preliminary crime scene walkthrough, they'd returned to the main office to interview Junior. Of course, they'd dealt with Junior before. The Blue Oasis Inn was just one of those places in the middle of bumfuck nowhere where bad shit occasionally happened. Wasn't anything special about the place itself, it wasn't built on an Indian burial ground, and it wasn't teeming with ghosts. No, it was just another highway stop on the way to California, at least as far as Jimmy Watkins was concerned. The Blue Oasis Inn was simply one of a dozen low-budget motels clinging to the shoulder of Route 66, the only main interstate that could take a traveler from West Texas to California. Sometimes bad shit just happened at night in the desert. It was part of the game. He was used to it. It was something that he'd become accustomed to when he worked back in El Paso a few years ago. Of course, being a border town, El Paso's crimes had been drastically different from anything he'd seen from Tucumcari to Albuquerque. But still, these experiences had prepared him for man's worst and most abominable acts. The calls they had gotten from Junior in the past were more complaints about tenants that wouldn't leave or dirt lake prostitutes that were scraping his parking lot for Johns. Hell, and even once when a local teen had spray painted a swastika on the giant neon palm tree sign, Jimmy wasn't sure Junior cared. Hell, he probably sympathized with it. But even Junior knew it was bad for business. But he never had called with panic in his voice. It had always been more of a complaint with a sigh. Tonight's call had been tinged with a fear that he didn't know Junior possessed. Hammy was leaning on the counter, his pen scissoring up and down across the tiny notepad, taking fastidious notes as Watkins interviewed Junior. Junior stood behind the counter, his meaty paws planted on it, his brow heavy, no doubt considering what deaths in room 100 would cost him in cleaning bills. It's one of those things that people don't think about. The splattery murder scene would be thoroughly investigated by the CSIs in their bunny suits and luminol wands. They would bag and tag evidence, take a bazillion photos, and then they'd leave, satisfied that they had enough intel to catch the perp. Only then, after hours of blood soaking into the shag and dripping down the walls, would the coroners be called in to pick up the bodies. But what people don't know is that after all of that's done, it's on the property owner to clean all of the brain and skull fragments out of the carpet. As Junior was being interviewed, it was all he could think about, just how much money it would cost him to get room 100 back in order, back to making him money. Jimmy pointed his slobbery toothpick at Junior as he paced around the tiny office.
So you say you had 10 people here last night? Only 10?
Junior scratched his chin, looked up at the sky as if counting them again, and replied,
About 10 of them. That sounds about right. So there was this Oriental couple and their 3 little brat kids. They were on the back side of the building. Room 206, if my memories are working properly.
Hemi flipped back a couple of pages and tapped his ledger with the tip of his pen.
And that's the Kims?
Yeah, Kim's. Yeah, that was them. And there was one guy, Mark something. Big, burly dude, trucker. Asked if he could have a room in the back because he wanted to park his rig. Of course, I let him. I got nothing but respect for those long haulers. That's a hard goddamn job.
Jimmy nodded. He'd encountered quite a few of them over the years. Real hard-asses with a real hard-ass job. But despite their burly physique, their gruff exterior, most of them were as harmless as St. Bernards. Junior snaked a hand underneath his Try Burning This Flag t-shirt and scratched his belly.
Well, obviously, the 2 dead ones.
Hemi flipped the pages of his notebook.
Ah, and a Mr. and Miss Hank Stevens.
Yeah, that was him. Seemed like a nice enough dude. I don't know. Anyway, who's that leave?
Junior tapped his chin and twiddled his meaty knuckles on the counter beside the desk bell.
Oh, there was this whore and a John in room 101. They paid cash and were gone before any of the fireworks. Well, I think before. I don't know. As I said before, I heard gunshots and I called you guys. But knowing how long it takes you boys to get over here, I grabbed my protection shotgun and headed over to take a look-see. There weren't anyone there. They probably finished their business and moved along.
Watkins paced.
Maybe. But I can't deny the proximity. If they were in the next room over, they surely could have had an interaction that turned deadly.
Watkins popped the toothpick back in his mouth. The Kims weren't suspects. They were on a family trip, not a murder spree. Sure, he'd do his due diligence and interview them in time, but it already seemed like a dead end. The trucker was intriguing. Couldn't be classed out of whole cloth. But honestly, he just didn't feel right either. So logically, that only left the hooker and her John. The ones that had paid in cash and skedaddled when the shit hit the fan. That was suspicious alone. And that was before adding on the fact that only a thin wall of sheetrock separated them from the dead. He didn't like to presuppose suspects, rather to let the evidence guide him, but so far, there wasn't any evidence. There were only assumptions. Sure, the crime scene investigators would find something, no doubt, they always did. But the longer he stood around doing nothing, the more miles his killer could be putting between himself and the dead. By the time his crime scene guys got prints or traced DNA, his suspect could be kicking sand in Baja.
So, this hooker and the John, you didn't get their names?
Yeah, sorry. They didn't look like the talking type. Sometimes, when it was time to get down to business, the guy would just clam up. Not a lot of smiling, happy talkers in the John game. And cash. Always cash with these guys. They couldn't risk their wives tapping along their credit card statements, showing where they've been shacked up without them. But what I can do is give you the best description I can from what I remember.
He fidgeted with his tobacco-stained mustache.
Let's see. The whore. She was wearing a dirty black sundress thing. She smelled as sour as piss. Black hair, pale skin, a real gothy type chick if you catch my drift.
He smiled. Despite that smell, he still wanted in her pants. She'd promised that she'd be back for him, but instead she'd fled. Maybe if the cops found her, he'd post her bail. He could think of a few ways she could work that debt off.
Now where was I? Oh, right, the John. Yeah, this dude had a plain t-shirt, jeans, and boots that were held together with duct tape. Nothing spectacular about him. Just a regular dude.
Hammy scribbled in his hand-sized notebook, nodding and checking his notes to make sure everything was properly cataloged.
Oh, I know something that might help. You want to know what kind of car he was driving?
He suddenly remembered. Pacing, chomping on his toothpick, his brows low and concentrating, Watkins replied.
Of course.
Junior smiled his rotten tooth grin.
Yeah, I figured maybe. And listen, I think this is a doozy of a detail for you. The car, and I remember it well because it was out of place in time. I'd only seen them in magazines and old movies my entire life. Never one in real life. And boys, I tell you, she was a beaut.
His eyes were full of the lust a man normally reserves in his heart for women.
A 1960 Plymouth Dart. Woo, she was sexy. Midnight black, just a little desert sand on the quarter panels. Low profile, high scoop back fins. She looked like she just rolled off a movie set. I swear to you. Pure old school American muscle. Now, they don't make them like that anymore, you know.
Hammy, can you go have Sally call out an APB on a 1960 Plymouth Dart? There can't be that many of them left out on the road.
Yes, sir.
Hammy flip closed his tiny notebook and pocketed it. He crammed his pen behind his ear and made for the parking lot. Junior leaned across the counter and whispered.
Hey, Hoss. Between me and you, I think it was that John. The guy had a fucking attitude problem. He had this look in his eye like he wanted to tussle when he came in asking for a room.
He stood back upright and returned his voice to its normal pitch. He started laughing, the words "try burning this flag" jumping against his gut.
But then again, what the fuck do I know? I just work here.
Thanks, Junior. Huge help. We will be in touch with you soon.
Junior waved one of his meaty paws, showing it was the least he could do. Watkins nodded thanks, left the office, and made his way for the police cruiser. Of course, Moon couldn't wait. She'd begged and pleaded with him to pull off the highway somewhere, anywhere, just so she could pee. She didn't care. She'd said she'd just hike up her skirt and squirt it out in the desert if she had to. She wasn't particular. But she'd warned if he didn't stop soon, his passenger seat would be irreparably damaged. But Rain didn't want to stop. He was trying to put some pavement between them and Tucumcari, between them and the cops that would soon undoubtedly be hot on their tails. But as she twisted and squirmed on the seat, he finally relented. About 140 miles east of Albuquerque, he saw a sign for a highway side town called Cuervo, and he took it. The highway exit quickly rolled through a small line of one-story, flat-roofed homes made of old bricks and concrete. He could tell that they'd once been painted in vibrant yellows and pinks, but they were now mostly bare, most of their paint having flaked off while baking under the relentless desert sun. Their tin roofs were rusted and concave. On the rare occasion it rained, he imagined they'd leak like sieves. Scant, malnourished trees burst out of broken windows. One home looked like it had been exploded from the inside. Its bricks lay broken and shattered around the desert scree. Only one wall remained standing, with an open door, remarkably, still on its hinges. Abandoned cars from the late 1950s that sat rusting on broken axles were parked beside them, tires long since popped and melted away. The town was abandoned. Its better days were firmly in its rear view, long before the interstate crew had bisected it with I-40. He pulled the Plymouth over to the side of the road, kicking up tiny dust devils and smashing flat an old styrofoam cup that read, "Kicks on Route 66. Moon hopped out and raced for a tiny brick mission church a few feet away. The church was still intact, but long since banned from parishioners. It was a small one-room stone church with a mission-style steeple, equipped with a silenced bell. The front door was chained shut and secured with an industrial-grade padlock. Moon squatted just to the right of the front door in the underbrush and began letting go. Rain got out of the car to stretch his legs, Hank's snub-nosed revolver still tucked in his waistband, now cold, but not forgotten. He kicked aside an old pull-tan Coors cab that had to have been there since America was testing nukes just up the road in Los Alamos. He walked around to the other side of the church, away from Moon's peeing, and toward a rusted, corrugated tin-roofed home. The once vibrant yellow paint had flaked off in chunks, revealing the concrete beneath that held everything together. The front windows had long ago been smashed away, and someone had taken off with the front door. Someone else had spray painted 2 black crosses on either side of the house's doorway. The names Caspar, Baltazar, and Melikor were sprayed in bold black letters just beneath the roofline. Rain didn't know the names, but they sounded demonic. Had some kids performed some sort of ritual here? Had they sacrificed a stray cat to this mighty Baltazar? He'd seen shit like that in the news. Places like this at night, they were full of energy, but in the day, they held their secrets close to their bones. Transfixed, he stood staring at the decaying home and the spray-painted words.
You pray?
He almost jumped as Moon had crept up behind him. She was wiping her hands on the back of her dusty dress. Huh? Was all Rain could muster, his brain still imagining a seance circle inside the home, with candles and cat blood, naked teens in a circle on their knees, bowing to the mighty Balthazar.
It's a simple yes or no question, Rain. I was just curious. Do you pray?
I mean, that's kind of a weird fucking question, don't you think? I mean, isn't prayer just supposed to be a private conversation between you and the God of your choosing?
Why are you always so goddamn difficult?
It was good to see her laugh again. Things had been pretty tense since the shootings at the hotel. She told him that she believed his story and that he'd done the right thing to try and protect the woman. But was she being honest? Was she scared of him, thinking that he was a stone-cold killer and that she could be next? He wasn't sure. He would never be sure.
Look, my parents were all neck-deep into all that Jesus bullshit. It sort of comes with the whole West Texas package. So I know a lot more about that Bible than is probably healthy. I only ask because of that.
She pointed at the crumbling yellow building, specifically at the words Caspar, Balthazar, and Melikor. All hail, mighty Balthazar. You imagine the kids chanting, naked and bloody, with a knife nearby. You know, I guess I'd have to say no. No, I haven't prayed since I was a teenager, and I begged God to fix my mother after the accident. But either he wasn't listening, or he thought the whole thing was a goddamn riot because he didn't do fuck all. Needless to say, I haven't prayed since. I don't see a reason to. I guess you could say that we aren't exactly on speaking terms. Moon nodded.
Oh, well, I get that. No doubt. I'm not on speaking terms with him for a far different reason that I'm not about to get into here. But I asked, because those words, those are the names of the 3 kings. The 3 kings that followed the star and brought baby Jesus the gifts that he had to return because they were all the wrong sizes. Well, except for the gold, I guess. He must have given that to Catholics.
The seance kids disappeared from his imagination in an instant. Instead, they were replaced by a priest on a small ladder with a can of spray paint, a helper standing nearby with an extra can, just in case he ran low, watching as the father sprayed out the lettering. It was far less Dark Lord metal, but it was probably more accurate.
Okay. So what, some sect do all this? They write those 3 names over their doorways as a blessing for protection? And honestly, it's probably a bunch of mumbo jumbo. But what the hell? We could use a little protecting. So I'm gonna take this as a sign.
Fuck all good it did them. Someone stole their door, Rain mumbled. Ignoring him, Moon closed her eyes, dipped her head in the direction of the spray-painted home, and dropped to a knee.
Dear Lord, baby Jesus, and whoever else wants to flip me a good old-fashioned solid from up there in magical Cloudland. Look, we are in a world of shit. My friend here, he did what he thought was right. That asshole was gonna kill that girl. He tried to do right by her. Well, you know what they say. Sometimes even the best intentions wind up in a tragically bloody fuckfest. Oh, sorry for the language. But you made me this way. And you, more than anyone else, knows this is how I am. So I ask you, Mr. All-Powerful and Burrito Supreme, will you and your 3 kings please see us through to California? I'm not asking for riches or a new bike or pony or anything like that. I'm just asking for a little 4-leaf rabbit foot style good luck for safe passage through the desert is all. Like you gave Moses and his flock. Well, you see, you've done it before. Look, I know I ain't no saint, but I'd really like to see the Pacific Ocean before I die. So, if you could see it in yourself to grant us a safe passage, I promise I'll join a California convent or something. Oh, you know me well enough. You know that's a line of bullshit. But I will try to do better.
In a moment of seriousness that was unusual for Moon, she whispered,
I will try to do better. But please don't punish us for doing what was right.
and in typical Moon fashion, that moment was short-lived.
Thank you, God. God bless, and sorry about all that shit we did to your son. It just wasn't cool.
Moon rose to her feet and backhanded dust from her skirt. You really think that did any good? Rain's voice was steeped in condescension. Moon shrugged and started for the car.
Well, couldn't make shit any worse.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Dark Passages. Please join us next week as the story continues. As always, if you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe, share, and rate and review us on iTunes or wherever else you get your podcasts. Please follow us on dark.passages.podcast on Instagram for additional information and episode release schedules. Original stories are all written by Chris Stone and are available on Amazon as ebooks. I'm Savannah, thank you for listening, and we will see you next week.